Many golfers, especially professionals, expect golf courses to be fair. Where did this idea come from? Was the notion of fairness in golf course design always important to players, or did it emerge at a particular time in history? Those are the questions I'm tackling today with the golf historian Bob Crosby. I'm Garrett Morrison, and this is Designing Golf. So I thought I'd do an extended introduction here to set up this episode. The topic is the historical roots of the idea of fairness in golf course design. Now, this might seem a little bit obscure, but I think it's actually one of the most important things to understand about golf architecture and about the history of golf in general, where this notion of fairness came from historically. This is sort of a companion piece, I guess, to an episode that I did a month ago with my colleague PJ Clark. PJ and I had a Golf Architecture 101 discussion of fairness. I don't think you need to listen to that episode to enjoy this one, but obviously the two of them together add up to something larger. PJ and I talked about a number of different possible definitions of fairness in golf architecture, but the key one, I think, and the most critical one for this episode is the idea that a fair golf course, quote unquote fair, should reward good shots and punish bad shots. That's the most basic definition of fairness that we're using here. So what Bob Crosby and I are going to do in this episode is trace this idea back to its initial emergence in golf discourse, which Bob locates around the 1880s and 1890s. This is when we first see golfers and golf writers start to explicitly articulate a theory of fairness in golf and start to emphasize the importance of fairness. As you'll hear Bob describe, one of the central figures in this discussion, and really the main proponent of fairness in golf course design, the original fairness police chief, so to speak, was Laidlaw Purves, a man named Laidlaw Purves. He was a big voice in the game in the late 1800s and early 1900s, kind of an obscure historical figure now. People don't talk about Purves much, but he was a big deal back in this era. And he ended up being the driving force behind the creation of Royal St. George's Golf Club, which has hosted a number of Open Championships, most recently in 2021, I believe, the one that Colin Morikawa won in any case. Now, on the other side of this debate, opposed to Laidlaw Purves, you have John Low, who really rose to prominence in golf in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. He became an influential figure in the R&A, and he wrote a book called Concerning Golf in 1903 that ended up having a major influence on the likes of Harry Colt, Tom Simpson, Alistair McKenzie, et cetera, et cetera. Low was opposed to this idea that golf and golf courses needed to be fair, and he made a number of eloquent arguments to that end. So that's John Low representing the opposite end of the spectrum from Laidlaw Purves and the Fairness Police. And Low, by the way, is the subject of a book that my guest Bob Crosby is writing. I can't wait for that book. I think it's going to be one of the best things ever written about golf history and golf course design. So no pressure, Bob. In any case, I just wanted to make sure that this basic duality is clear. Laidlaw Purves arguing for absolute fairness in golf, John Low arguing that fairness should not be the objective either of the rules or of golf architecture. And this philosophical difference ended up informing another duality that we've discussed in this podcast before. Laidlaw Purves, because of his devotion to fairness, promoted what we now call the penal school of golf architecture, which means basically hazards positioned to catch poorly struck shots. You have cross bunkers that you have to carry, bunkers on the sides that punish hooks and slices, and so on. This philosophy produces what Bob Crosby will call a kind of steeplechase golf course. obstacles that you have to jump over and otherwise avoid. John Lowe, on the other hand, was perhaps the earliest advocate of what we now refer to as the strategic school of golf architecture. This is where hazards are not meant to merely punish, but also to make the game more interesting and intellectually stimulating. The hazards create risk-reward scenarios. If you challenge them, you get a reward, but you can always choose to steer clear of them, play conservatively, and not pursue those birdies and eagles. Lowe believed that this was a more heroic and romantic form of the game, less defensive than the kind of golf that Purves promoted. So that's the opposition that Bob and I are digging into in this conversation. It's Purves versus Lowe, fairness police versus anti-fairness police, penal versus strategic. So we will get to Bob Crosby in a minute, but first, a word from our sponsor for this episode, the USGA Green Section. Are you dreaming of a career that blends hands-on learning with upward mobility? The USGA Greenkeeper Apprenticeship Program, or GAP, is a one-year tuition-free pathway into golf course maintenance. Apprentices earn while they learn. They get 240 hours of classroom instruction, plus 2,000 hours of on-the-job training at top courses in the Carolinas. This program is backed by a $1 million investment from the USGA and partners like Pinehurst Resort, Ewing Outdoor Supply, and the Carolinas Golf Association. Apprentices gain skills in turfgrass science, soil and water management, pest control, and leadership. More than half of the graduates of GAP have been promoted to leadership positions after completing the program. Applications are now open for the 2026 cohorts in Pinehurst and Myrtle Beach. So check it out. This is a great way to get into the golf course maintenance industry. You can jumpstart your career in turf management by joining GAP today. Visit www.usga.org/GAP. That's usga.org/GAP. All right, let's get to my conversation with Bob Crosby. So Bob Crosby, we are talking about the history of the idea of fairness in golf course design. An intimidatingly huge subject, but I suppose where we could start is where do you think the idea of fairness entered golf course design historically? What year or decade would you go back to?
First, delighted to be with you again, Garrett. There really isn't much talk about fairness in golf until about 1880. It doesn't really show up in the rules. There's very little talk at the time anyway about golf architecture. But it does begin to show up in about 1880 with the English golf boom. And the English golf boom was basically a group of middle-class Victorian golfers in England who were new to the game, who brought to golf a very Victorian sports ethos. They had, over the prior decades, already enacted reforms in other popular sports like football or soccer, rugby, cricket, even tennis, literally every sport. And those reforms had been enormously successful. They had included things like forming a representative/democratic union to manage the affairs of the sport. They had enacted uniform rules that applied everywhere, the sorts of things that golf in 1880 or so lacked. So they came to golf eager to overlay on golf a system of reforms that had already been enormously successful. The key figure in that movement was Laidlaw Purves. His ambitions for golf are breathtaking in 1880 or so. And he viewed the whole ball of wax as being subject to reform. And by whole ball of wax, I mean rules and golf architecture. He did not really separate the two, and nor should he have. The issues were really very similar. And the issue in both was there's a problem with fairness. That golf, there are lots of things we can change with golf, but the core issue for golf, and this is fairly unique to golf, is that the results of a good shot often didn't correspond with the quality of the shot. That was a problem that Laidlaw, Purves, and others thought needed to be fixed. And it needed to be fixed in two ways. One was to amend rules to basically privilege good shots, and also to propose a different kind of golf course that would do essentially the same sort of thing. But in the early 1880s, Purves's London course, Wimbledon, enacts a new set of rules. And those rules reflect his concerns with fairness, equity, and justice. Terms that I get to note again rarely appeared in the R&A rules. Second, he designed, after some false starts at Felixstowe and Epsom, he designed St. George's. The Royal came later, near Sandwich. Both the rules he proposed and the golf course he designed at Sandwich were supposed to pull on the same oar. They were both supposed to be fair presentations of the game, in the sense that they cleared the way for good shots. They would not be impeded in any way, and make real trouble for less good shots. The notion here was that there would be a bright line distinction between, and this is Purves's term, the far and sure shot and the less far and sure shot, whatever that would be. I would note in passing that the original logo for Golf Magazine, and it may have stayed on the logo through its existence till the 1930s, was also far and sure. They were allies. That was Purves's program. That is not just a matter of somebody's opinion that he threw out there. He had behind him, he had to his back, were by 1890, the most powerful group of golfers in Britain. By 1890, there were more golfers south of the Tweed than north of the Tweed. They had much more money. They had much more clout in media. They actually had very appealing arguments for why golf ought to become more equitable or fair. They put their opponents in the position of having to defend a sport as being unfair. And that's not an enviable position to be in. The issues that Purves raised, and I want to get back to the response to that in a minute, but the issues that Purves raised are still very much alive today. And they always have been in the decades since then. I mean, today we still argue about whether there ought to be relief from a divot in a fairway. Tom Doak still quotes criticisms of his courses as basically turning on the issue of their being unfair. I think it was last year at the Masters, Bernhard Langer complained about the unfairness of the 15th green. He hit what he called a perfect wedge shot that sucked back off the green. And he thought that was unfair. He ended up, I think, apologizing later for that. But the issue of fairness in golf has never left it, and was very much still with the game. I think it was the single most important development in golf. in the sense that it continues to be a core dynamic in the evolution of the game. And that by that, I mean proposed changes to the rules, how we think about golf course design, all that. But by 1890 or so, resistance to that begins to organize itself. The first to do so was Walter Simpson. We associate Walter Simpson with his book, The Art of Golf, which is sort of a lighthearted frolic through the game. But Simpson had actually a very dire view of the future of golf, primarily because of the initiatives of Purves and others about changing rules and the different kinds of golf courses. And he was a staunch objector to the whole equity project. Another was another forgotten figure, Benjamin Hall Blythe, who ended up becoming the first chairman of the R&A Rules Committee, but a very powerful conservative golfer in the late 1880s into the 1890s. And by the early 1890s, my man John Lowe is joining the fray. I think it was a pivotal moment in the history of the game, in part because the reaction to that and the movement and the English golf movement, we call it Victorian today, but at the time it was called English. The reaction to the English golf movement, I think, basically helps explain the shape of modern golf in the following ways. The threat of English golf reforms was real. By the mid-1890s, there were good reasons to think that it would take over the game, that golf courses would be designed along the lines of the original sandwich course, which is to say lots of cross bunkers, carry hazards, and all sorts of things like that.
Penal architecture, basically, what we now refer to as penal design.
What we would say, yeah, penal architecture. But it wasn't just golf courses. It was also the rules would now have, as a standard for whether or not a rule should be in the rule book, was whether or not it was, quote, fair. That is not a standard today. And finally, should we regulate balls and golf clubs? I think all of that began to change in the late 1890s in response to the forces being applied to the game by English golfers led by Laidlaw Purves. And by that I mean within about a 2-year period, the R&A Rules Committee was formed, and it promulgated its first rules in late 1899. Those rules were based on the traditional rules. While they cleaned up a lot of stuff, they did not give in to any of the suggestions from Purves and others to make the rules based on fairness. The second aspect of that within about a year later was Lowe articulates the basic principles of strategic golf architecture. And that basically took off after that. It changed the face of the game. And finally, about 6 months after that, the Haskell ball appears. And people want to know how to respond to the golf ball. Lowe, from the very beginning, says that we should put limits on balls and clubs. He didn't win that fight until 20 years later, when the first rules regulating balls were put into effect. But the issue was on the table at about the same time as the R&A Rules Committee, about the same time as the formulation of modern golf architecture. And it was an incredibly important moment, all of which, I think, was triggered by the desire of English/Victorian golfers to make the game fair. That issue, the tension caused by that issue, lives, I think, at the heart of golf and has ever since.
It was sort of the center of the debate about what golf should be in the 1880s, 1890s, and the first decade of the 20th century. So It is a really useful lens through which to talk about golf and the way it was thought about during this period. But it's also a huge subject because it relates to pretty much everything that people were discussing at the time. And so it's both a useful topic to discuss and a very difficult one to discuss because it's so big. I want to go back on the timeline a little bit here. You talked about fairness kind of entering the discourse around the 1880s, and this happened to be the time that the game was beginning to move to England and was beginning to move inland. People were starting to build courses. They weren't just laying them out on well-suited land. They were starting to have to actually construct golf courses because they were building them on land that was somewhat resistant to golf. It was in England, and the group of people around the game in England was different in character and class and kind of cultural context than the group of people that was driving the game in Scotland previously. So you have this kind of clash of perspectives, this new big force in the game that's coming from a very different place than the original golfers of Scotland came from. So I want to talk a little bit about the original golfers of Scotland and the notion of fairness. It seems to me, and what you're saying kind of confirms this, that to the extent that we know what early golfers of the Scottish links thought about the game, and we may not know that much, fairness didn't really seem to be part of it. And if we look at the courses that they played, those courses would probably strike 21st century golfers as extremely unfair. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. If you could give me an idea of what those original courses were like and how all of that might have related to the idea of fairness or the lack of an idea of fairness that existed at the time.
Old Tom Morris, I bow back into this way. Old Tom Morris designed a lot of golf courses. If he had a theory of golf course design, he never wrote it. He never wrote about it. He never told it to anybody. I think he, along with a lot of his other peers in Scotland, basically laid out golf courses on land that seemed suitable to them, that had enough acreage, and that was, that would drain reasonably well, presumably. And that seemed to be the end of the questions. I mean, these were professionals for the most part. And there is remarkably little discussion about golf architecture per se in the literature through the 1890s. And so we don't really quite know what they were thinking, if they were thinking anything at all, other than just get 18 holes on this tract of land and collect your fee and move on. There doesn't seem to be a theory of golf design that Old Tom or anybody else of his era bought into. Purves changed that. Purves's revolution was to say, I'm going to design a golf course on paper, and I'm going to build it to that design. And that's what he did at Sandwich. And the design he wanted for that golf course was specifically directed at creating bright line distinctions between a well-hit shot and a not so well-hit shot. And that was what the cross bunkers were supposed to do. That's what the difficulties on the edges of the fairways were supposed to do. That's what the flat greens and flat fairways were supposed to do, at least in theory, because the well-hit shot was to be privileged. The badly hit shot was to be hammered. But there was no countervailing philosophy of golf design at the time Sandwich opens, and this is 1887. And that was in part why I think it was so profoundly influential. Every golf course built in England thereafter, almost, I think, had its set of, it was the steeplechase courses. They had their sets of cross bunkers. as far as I can tell, Garrett, almost every course built in America before 1910 or so had its set of cross bunkers. And it is the influence of Sandwich St. George's on that was profound. And it's in part because there was no other ideas in the field. That was it. And if you look at surveys of best holes or favorite holes done in the 1890s, and this is Horace Hutchinson, this is all the pros, all the usual pro names, all those guys, they all recite the formula that Purves first devised to build Sandwich, which is to say holes have to be of a certain length to provide for full shots, that you have to have carry hazards for each shot to test the good shot versus the bad shot, et cetera, et cetera. All of them recite the mantra. And there was really no competing theory of golf architecture as late as the mid-1890s. Mm-hmm. So to get back to your original question, I don't know what the old Toms were thinking, other than get a golf course laid on the land. If he was trying to make it as attractive as possible, I mean, in many cases he did that, but I don't think that seemed to be a big goal of his. Purves lands in a vacuum. And partly because it was a vacuum is why he was so influential. By the way, an interesting footnote on this is that Tom Dunn and the Dunn family, who were profligate in building steeplechase golf courses in England and in America, different family members came over here. Tom Dunn spent a lot of time with Purves, both at Wimbledon and as they were building Royal St. George's, and in a couple places raves about the design, and then he carries those ideas to build hundreds of golf courses, either he or his family, hundreds of golf courses. So there is a sort of a linkage between Tom Dunn and other, quote, Victorian golf architects and Laidlaw Purves.
This episode of Designing Golf is presented by Mercedes-Benz. For more than 30 years, Mercedes-Benz has supported golf around the world by partnering with the most prestigious major championships, tournaments, and players in the professional game. Mercedes-Benz SUVs are the perfect companions for golf enthusiasts seeking performance, style, and space on the way to the course. And the GLS stands out as the pinnacle of this lineup. The GLS combines power and finesse, backed by 12 driver assist systems, nimble handling, cutting-edge AI technology, and superb craftsmanship. The GLS anticipates your needs, ensuring every journey is as strategic as a championship-winning game plan. The GLS reflects Mercedes-Benz's philosophy to deliver the world's greatest vehicles. The Mercedes-Benz GLS, even standing still, it's moving forward. Learn more about the GLS and Mercedes-Benz's full lineup of SUVs at mbusa.com. All right, let's get back to the episode. If there's any philosophy behind the design of early Scottish links courses, you have to kind of discern it from the courses themselves. And there might be something there. There might be an interesting study to do there. I'm not sure if anybody has really done that, looking at old Tom Morris courses and deriving a kind of architectural philosophy that he might have had from those courses. But one effect, I suppose, of building golf on the land that old Tom Morris and other early course designers built courses on is that the game could be somewhat random sometimes. Chance was a big part of the game because of the chaotic nature of the linksland ground. Balls would take unpredictable bounces. The land was bumpy and lumpy. They didn't have the ability to grade it flat, or maybe even the desire to grade it flat. And so the ball would do unpredictable things once it landed. You had the wind, and the wind is always a really difficult to predict force in itself. And so the game had a big element of randomness about it. Then you have these primarily English Victorian designers come along. They are trying to apply some sort of intellectual framework to the laying out of golf courses. And it seems almost inevitable that they would come to the conclusion that they could create a better golf course by organizing it a bit more and making the game less predictable, which would then presumably highlight skill more and would create better competitions. I guess that was the rationale. And it's almost like they were trying to turn golf into tennis in a sense, right? Where they were trying to have a kind of standardized court for the playing of the game. And that would often involve, you've referred to cross bunkers. You have to carry one bunker off the tee, then you have to carry another bunker to get to the green. The landing areas would be relatively flat. So once you got to them, then you would have a flat lie that you could hit from. You wouldn't be quote unquote punished for hitting the ball in the middle of the fairway. But once you were off the corridor, once you were off the garden path, then you could be punished. But if you kept it in the straight and narrow, then you were to be rewarded. So flat greens, flat fairways, bunkers surrounding each target, and there you had presumably the ideal golf course. And a lot of these characteristics that I'm talking about were present in that original Royal St. George's course, but have since been lost over the years at that course and many other courses built in this era. But that was, I guess that was sort of the mindset that led to going from these beautiful natural links courses to these very much more organized, sometimes inland courses that were built in the late 19th century. I guess my question is that when you consider the mindset of somebody like Laidlaw Purves or Tom Dunn, whom you referred to and was a prolific designer of these Victorian style steeplechase tennis-like golf courses, where do you think that mindset comes from culturally? And then if you could take us forward a few years, where do you think the reaction to this mindset, represented by John Lowe, Tom Simpson, Harry Colt, later Alistair McKenzie, all the Golden Age designers, they were kind of reacting to this Victorian philosophy of golf course design. Where did that reaction come from? What were its roots in history and culture? It's a big question, but I'm confident that you can tackle it.
That's a big question. Where to begin? I'll start with the first part of that question about what is the cultural background to courses like Royal St. George's and its progeny. We tend to forget that the Victorian mindset, they viewed themselves as progressives. They thought that they were bringing to golf modernity, new ideas. Remember, England in 1890 it was at the height of its empire. It believed, and you can look it up, it believed that their way of organizing politics, society, law, or everything else was superior to anyone else's.
And that it would continue to get better. They believed, they were extremely optimistic.
Well, that's the Whig theory of history. That's right. The Whig. You've read the Butterfield books, but at any rate, and they were going to impart that superior knowledge and understanding of the world to their colonies. They were going to a rationale for why they held India as a colony, or why they held Ireland, frankly, as a colony, was because only they could impart to those colonies, and there were many other colonies that in the British Empire, because they were going to impart to those colonies better ways of managing their daily lives, better ways of better legal systems, better legislatures, all that sort of stuff. That mindset, they brought that mindset to golf. They were going to take what they viewed as an archaic provincial sport and fix it. The first and lowest fruit to pick was this randomness in golf that you found on so many of the old links courses. They found that sort of randomness a sign of inattention, that it's something that needs to be rectified by a more systematic kind of design that will limit that. There'll always be randomness because you're playing outdoors and it's going to happen. But to the extent you can minimize randomness in golf was one of their key goals.
That was nature, and they had science, and they believed that nature could be improved by science.
And it was important because the only way you can yield to a well-hit shot its just rewards was to make sure randomness was minimized. And that was the key dynamic in their thinking. That they were going to bring to golf the enlightenment that only Englishmen could bring, and golf was way past due for receiving their benefits. Purves and his allies, and he had many allies, really believed he was doing golf a favor. I'm here to help you out because you've lost your way, or you never found your way. And it was that sort of moralistic worldview that he wanted to bring to golf to tighten it up. He wanted to put structure on golf that it didn't have previously. And I think you mentioned, to the extent it might make golf more mechanical, more like tennis, it'd be just target shooting. A lot of Tate basically refers to sandwich as target shooting. I mean, all you do is you hit your drive straight and in the air, and that's the end of the questions. And then the second part of your question is the harder, thicker part, which is...
That's getting into what the response was to this philosophy of golf course design and how it came about.
I think there's a way to summarize the response to that by saying, and here John Lowe is, I think, the key, is that by the late 1890s, there was the conservatives, and I'm using the term only in the sense of golf conservatives.
Yeah, the conservatives, when you say the conservatives, you're talking about those who responded to this quote-unquote modern and progressive form of golf course design that was pioneered by Laidlaw, Purves, and others. The reason why conservative might be an appropriate term here is that John Lowe and others were looking to the traditions of the game to inform their new golf architecture.
They were the defenders of the traditional game, and they were conservative in that sense. I think what happened by the late 1890s is that the conservatives, the defenders of the traditional game, were able to reawaken people's appreciation of the virtues of the traditional game. They had basically been sort of under attack for almost 2 decades at that point from the progressives who wanted to modernize golf, who wanted to bring it into at the time it had been, bring it into the 19th century. And they were able to reawaken the appeal of the older traditional game. And they did that in a couple of ways. One was that Lowe argued that with regard to both, Lowe was more involved in some respects with the rules than he was with golf architecture. But that his argument is that being able to play, for example, St. George's Well, or being able to play under the rules of Wimbledon, which was a different kind of rules from St. Andrews, called for a sort of mechanical kind of golf. It was a focus on the athletic skills required to hit the ball well. Lowe's argument was that the traditional game called upon a much broader range of human attributes. It wasn't just athletic skill, that was certainly part of it, but it was also being able to think and analyze, work through situations, perseverance, the overcoming of adversity, all sorts of various things that he thought only the traditional game forced a golfer to confront. And that was, I think, at the heart of why he felt it was so important to revive the traditional game in the face of what would have at the time seemed the inevitable triumph of Laidlaw, Purves, and English golf. And you've read enough history books where history is contingent. It might have turned out differently. And in this case, I can't think of a better case in golf where golf might have taken a very different turn circa 1898 or so if the R&A had not formed the Rules Committee, and they almost didn't. If Lowe hadn't taken the pains to set out and articulate a theory of golf architecture that we now call strategic golf architecture, if that stuff hadn't happened in response, I think, in both those cases, to the advances of Laidlaw, Purves, golf might be a very different game. You would not have been unreasonable to think in 1898 that golf was on the cusp of a complete conversion to a different kind of game. It didn't happen, but it wasn't inevitable.
Well, and part of what made this response to Victorian golf course design successful is all the arguments that John Lowe and others marshaled to the defense of their own philosophy. The arguments that they made in support of strategic golf design, the arguments that they made in support of the retention of randomness and an element of luck in the game. So what were some of those arguments? What were the main arguments that this group of people made that golf courses shouldn't just be these tennis courts? They should be something more than that.
Start with the rules. Walter Simpson makes some arguments that Lowe really tracks later on. Walter really drops out of the, Sir Walter, actually really drops out of the mix by 1891-92. He has health issues and other things. But in three essays he wrote in the late 1880s and early 1890s, and a couple of letters and some other exchanges, Simpson makes the argument that the idea applying fairness to golf rules is to indulge in what's called a category mistake. You're applying something to golf that doesn't belong to golf, and that is to say fairness. Fairness belongs in judicial systems. They should be fair because they need the concurrence of the people that over which it has control. It is able to take your personal liberty and property from you. It ought to be fair. It ought to be perceived as fair. Golf is just a sport. If you don't like its rules, find another sport. The rules in golf have only one simple obligation. It's very humble and modest, and that is to make for an interesting game. It has no aspirations to being moral or to be fair or just or other synonyms for the word fairness. It is not like a legal system that has various restraints on it. The one example that the Purves and other reformers bring up time and time again, and A.J. Robertson in golf conducts, I think, 2 different surveys on the topic, trying to tease out support for the idea, is the stymie. The stymie was particularly irksome to Purves and Robertson and others, because you could be stymied even after a good shot. You were punished. The punishment you incurred had nothing to do with the quality of the shot you hit.
And it had relatively little to do with the quality of the shot that your opponent hit, too,
right,
because it was essentially random.
Right. And so it really, the elimination of the stymie was a buzzword for Purves, Robertson, all through the 1880s, 1890s. That it was finally eliminated in, I think, 1952 or something like that, that it was finally eliminated would have had John Lowe spinning in his grave. He thought that was an exquisite shot that you needed to learn how to hit, that it was one of the challenges of playing the game, that yes, there was an element of randomness to it, but then there ought to be in golf an element of randomness, that luck played a role, and get used to it. And you know, so that was his hobby horse. In terms of golf architecture, it was much similar sorts of concerns, which is that the goal of a course like Royal St. George's at the time is, you're right, it's gone through several changes since, including the elimination of the maiden hole and other holes. But the whole concept was to minimize randomness by way of a golf course that tested, fairly as objectively as it could, the physical ability to hit a golf ball, quote, far and sure. And Purves goes on to say that in the mid, when St. George's comes under criticisms finally in the 1890s, he says, look, there's one distinguishing feature for good golf, and that's hitting the ball straight and long. And that's what I want to test. The other stuff is just dross. And my course does that. And that's the idea. Again, there is a kind of shot that has an independent status for Purves, and that's the good, long, straight shot. Everything is built around rewarding that shot. The obvious response from Lowe was, well, that might be in some situations the right shot to hit, but it might not be in other situations. So at any rate, they went back and go on. But
yeah, very familiar to anyone who has heard a current day professional golfer talk about the game and what should be rewarded. Randall Chambly is obsessed with far and sure. So these ideas about what should be rewarded and prioritized in golf through its architecture, through its rules, are still very much part of how we discuss the game. Now, the counter arguments to that kind of seemingly rationalist position, that the main thing about golf is hitting it long and straight, the counter arguments to that can sometimes be a little bit romantic sounding. Golf is like life. Life has an element of luck and randomness. Therefore, golf should imitate life and introduce these chaotic factors intentionally, even through golf course design. That is kind of a bit of a romantic argument that might be easy to dismiss. It's like, okay, just go on about that. Golf is like life. What people might start rolling their eyes. But I think the maybe more persuasive argument, not necessarily more valid, but maybe more persuasive to a larger amount of people, is that when you completely rationalize a golf course and consistently reward good shots or well-struck shots in a consistent way, golf just becomes a little bit more boring, right? The thing that makes golf exciting a lot of times is that element of chance. And without that, the game just loses its interest to a degree. And I think we see this in the holes that people want to watch high-level golfers play. The road hole, the 15th hole at Augusta National, the postage stamp at Royal Troon. These holes have a big element of luck about them, and that's kind of why we want to watch them. We know that high-level players can hit a consistent shot, and a golf course that just rewards them in a perfectly predictable way is, it might be fair, it might identify the best golfer or whatever, but over the long term, it's not going to be particularly interesting to watch. We want to see luck enter the game at some moments, and that's not always fair. So the two different kinds of arguments there. Golf is like life, a little bit romantic. Some people might dismiss it. Golf needs to be exciting, and it's only exciting when it's unpredictable. That might be an argument that would gain a little more purchase with more people. Is the way I'm thinking about that valid, do you think?
Yeah. Lowe didn't make an argument about golf is like life, but he did make arguments about golf luck should have a factor, should play a role. I would come at it slightly differently, or Lowe would come at it slightly differently. Lowe was in some respects a snob. So was Alistair McKenzie. So was Harry Cole. So was a lot of them. Bernard Darwin, for one. Lowe was a snob in this sense, and I'm getting at your question, believe it or not. It wasn't so much that he thought golf ought to be more like life with all of its ups and downs. It's that golf ought to be a sport that appeals to the educated, sophisticated Edwardian gentleman. And that means it can't be a single-dimensional kind of sport where do you hit the ball well or not. It ought to have a whole bunch of factors that figure into how you play the game. He says at one point that, artisans and middle-class people like to just have these simple tests where they go out and they try to hit balls. It is the more sophisticated, and he uses the word educated gentleman, that has a different kind of taste for sport. And that's what he thinks golf ought to be oriented towards. McKenzie, in the spirit of St. Andrews, I think says something very, very similar. By the way, who notes Lowe as the father of modern golf architecture, I think 6 times in that book. But that's who he wants to appeal to. And it's not the touchy-feely sort of artsy-fartsy stuff. He wants to appeal to the sophisticated gentleman. That doesn't fly today. You can't say that today unless you're in an interview with Garrett Morrison. But that is certainly, I think, part of what is the appeal of people like Doak and Crenshaw and other people, is that they're trying to. Their golf courses require a reasonable amount of sophisticated thought. Some people don't like that, don't want to be bothered, and that's fine. But some people do, and I think the best golf courses do require a certain level of thought, reflection, and analysis. The holes you mentioned are 3 or 4 of many that do so. That's what Lowe is trying to recover from the crusades that Purves was on to change over golf to a more purely athletic sport.
It's an effort to make a golf course worthy of as much thought and analysis as a work of literature or a painting, right? Where there are layers to peel away, where there are elements that are unexpected and sometimes even provocative. the more you make a golf course kind of scientifically laid out and fair, the fewer of those layers it has. It doesn't have those kind of little rough edges to it. It has a kind of predictable and rational form. But if you're somebody that Lowe was thinking about when he talked about the educated person, you're thinking about somebody who studied poetry and has an appreciation for artistic things, and people who have that appreciation are kind of the tendency to appreciate things that are not just smoothed out and rational, that have these little thorny complexities that make a piece of art interesting to consider. And it's almost as if they were trying to bring golf course architecture into the arts rather than into the sciences.
I think that's right. In 1901, Lowe wrote a long response to what was the famous rating golf courses that Golf Illustrated had which is his first real articulation of the basics of strategic golf architecture. What's interesting about the piece is that his last long paragraph in that piece begins with a sentence that says something like the following: when Harry Varden stands on the tee to the 17th hole at the Old Course, he's presented with a problem that requires thought. It isn't just a question of hitting a certain kind of the course dictating a certain kind of shot. He's got several things to consider. And it's the architecture that promotes that sort of response by a golfer as good as Harry Varden that we ought to try to emulate. That's where we ought to try to go. Lowe was making an argument, a very appealing argument for us today, that seems to can make you tear up sometimes. It's so wonderful. But remember, at the time, he was fighting against what he feared was going to be a takeover of golf by a very different set of ideas. And he feared reasonably, I think, that was on its way to happening. And he was the rear guard. He was trying to recover the holes at the Old Course. He was trying to rediscover what was in them that made them so appealing, to make a case against the Purveses. And it was somewhat desperate. There were real fears that they were going down with the ship. And it turned out that they snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. But he had recovering the virtues of the road hole was of a piece with beating back the forces of reform coming up from south of the Tweed. And that historical context is critically important, I think, to understanding the origins of modern golf architecture, modern golf, period. Rules, ball limitations, club limitations, all that. For Lowe thought in his heart of hearts that the appeal to fairness was really a way to avoid the difficulties of the game. That it was basically a way to smooth out golf's rough edges. And that's why he was so adamant in opposing it, because it was those rough edges that mattered at the end of the day. That the movement for a fair game had in its dark little heart a different agenda, which was to make golf easier. Lowe believed that the non-democratic nature of the R&A Rules Committee was important in that regard. They were not subject to popular opinion, because if you let its nose under the tent, golf will automatically become a lot easier. And that's what Purves wanted to do. Purves had advocated since 1885 or so, up until the very last minute, the formation of a British golf union that would be democratic, that would be comprised of representatives from all the significant clubs in Britain, including the R&A, but it would only be one club among many. Plans were made for setting up the headquarters in London. It was on its way. That sort of an organization, subject to a popular vote, would have enacted very different rules from the one the R&A was willing to enact, because it would have been subject to popular pressures to make golf, quote, easier or to smooth out its edges or that sort of thing. Much like as in golf architecture, as in the rules, there was a fight over similar sorts of core issues. You can't write this kind of a history, and I'm trying to write it right now, without writing a very different kind of golf history. This is not going to be a history that talks about who won what golf tournament. And it's not going to be a history about who designed what golf course, although there'll be a little bit of that. Those are sort of breaking down golf into some atomistic sort of individual events, and you lose the forest for the trees, I think. Golf has there are long-running themes in golf over which people have fought generation after generation, including our generation. And those long-running themes really all begin to coalesce at about the same time, roughly 1895, 1900. And writing that kind of a history of golf is a different sort of enterprise. And it's damn hard.
Well, Bob, I can't wait for your book to come out. No doubt about it, because it's going to contribute exactly this kind of perspective on the history of the game, where we're talking about long-running ideas that are still relevant today, and fairness is chief among those.
All right. Yeah, no, I absolutely. We tend to forget that, and this applies certainly to the voluminous writings on golf architecture that you and I we've all read. Those are written polemically. They're not written descriptively. They're fighting fights. Simpson, McKenzie, Lowe, Colt, everybody, they're fighting against an enemy. And the enemy
there are stakes to what they're saying.
There's stakes to what they're saying. And those polemics track through the history of the game. It was always a fight. Still is.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down with me today, Bob. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. It's been too long since the last time we had one of our discussions, and I'll make sure to have you on again soon.
Great. Enjoyed it. Thank you, Garrett.
This episode of Designing Golf was produced by Will Balsam. Thank you, Will. If you have been enjoying Designing Golf, then first of all, leave us a rating and review wherever you happen to be listening to us, and check out Fried Egg Golf Club, FEGC. Go to thefriedegg.com/membership to see everything that we're offering there. But we're building an awesome community of golf enthusiasts in Fried Egg Golf Club, and we would love for you to join us. Now, one of the most recent benefits of an FEGC membership is the ability to enter a Design a Hole contest, which we're running with Andy Staples, the golf architect Andy Staples. Andy is building a par 3 course called Ace Valley at Breezy Point Resort in Minnesota. One of the holes on this actual physical real golf course is going to be a contest hole that is designed by somebody in Fried Egg Golf Club. The hole is going to be based on a template. So some kind of famous green complex or hole from around the world is going to be adapted to the site. And the idea is going to come from somebody in FEGC. So check out the details of this contest on thefriedegg.com. We have all the information there. But in order to enter, you need to be a member of FEGC. So if that sounds fun to you, then join us and let's let's do a design contest. I think it's going to be pretty awesome. I can't wait to see what our members come up with. All right, that's it. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.